We're going to start competition. First team on the board, Carter and Florian. For execution, 4.5, 4.5, 5, 6. For synchro, 6, 3.5, 5.5, 5, 6. Stefano and Francesco. For execution, 7, 6.5, 7.5, 7.5. For synchro, 7, 7, 7, 6, 6.5. Rain and London. For execution, 6, 5.5, 5.5, 7. For synchro, 6.5, 6, 7, 7.5, 7. Nikki and Susanna. For execution, 5.5, 5, 5.5, 5. For synchro, 6.5, 6, 5.5, 6.5, 6.5. Hannah and Shad. For execution, 5, 5.5, 5, 6. For synchro, 6, 6.5, 6, 6.5, 6.5. Electra and Elisa. For execution, 7, 6.5, 6, 7. For synchro, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 8. Manu and Maud. For execution, 6.5, 7, 5, 6. For synchro, 7, 6, 6.5, 6.5, 7. Kira and Bahar. execution, 4.5, 5, 6, 6. For synchro, 6.5, 6, 5.5, 6, 6.5. Naomi en Renske. For execution, 5.5, 6, 5.5, 5.5. For synchro, 6.5, 7.5, 6.5, 6.5, 6.5. Anne-Sophie en Elma. For execution, 5.5, 5.5, 7, 7. For synchro, 6, 7, 6, 6, 6.5. Moekta en Guurtje. For execution, 7, 6.5, 5, 6. For synchro, 7, 7, 7, 7, 6.5. Dorothea en Dorka. For execution, 6.5, 6.5, 6, 6. For synchro, 7, 7.5, 7.5, 7, 7. Claudia en Rebecca. For execution, 6, 6.5, 3.5, 4. For synchro, 5.5, 6, 5, 5.5, 5.5. Round 2. Carter and Florian. For execution, 5, 5, 5.5, 4.5. For synchro, 5.5, 5.5, 5.5, 5, 5.5. Stefano and Francesco. For execution, 7.5, 6.5, 8, 7.5. For synchro, 8, 8, 7.5, 8, 8.5. Ray en Lachlan.
Suavemente, bésame, que quiero sentir tus labios besándome otra vez.
For execution, 5.5, 5.5, 6.5, 7. For Synchro, 7, 7.5, 6.5, 6.5, 7. Nikki and Susanna. Five, 4.5, 4, 3.5 for execution, and for Synchro, 5, 5, 5, 5.5, 6. Hannah and Shad. For execution, 4, 4.5, 6, 7. For Synchro, 5, 4.5, 5.5, 6.5, 6. Electra and Elisa. For execution, 6.5, 7, 7, 6. For Synchro, 7.5, 8.5, 7, 6.5, 7.5. Manu and Maud. For execution, 3.5, 4, 4, 4.5. For Synchro, 4, 3, 4, 4.5, 4.5. Kira and Bara. For execution, 4.5, 4.5, 6, 6. For Synchro, 5, 4.5, 4.5, 6, 6. Naomi and Renske. For execution, 5.5, 6, 6, 5.5. For Synchro, 6.5, 6, 6, 6.5, 7. Anne-Sophie and Elma. execution, 6.5, 6, 6.5, 6.5. For Synchro, 5.5, 6.5, 5.5, 5.5, 6.5. Mukta en Guurtje. For execution, 5, 6, 5.5, 5.5. For Synchro, 6, 5.5, 6, 5, 6. Dorothea en Dorka. For execution, 6.5, 6, 6, 6. For Synchro, 6.5, 6.5, 7, 7, 7. Claudia en Rebecca. Execution, 6.5, 7, 4.5, 5. And for Synchro, 6.5, 7, 6.5, 7, 6. Round 3, Carter en Florian. For execution, 6.5, 5, 4, 5. For Synchro, 5, 4.5, 5.5, 4, 4. Stefano and Francesco. For execution, 6.5, 6, 6.5, 7. For Synchro, 7, 7, 7.5, 6.5, 6.5. Ray and Lachlan. For execution, 7, 7, 5.5, 5.5. For Synchro, 6.5, 7.5, 7, 7.5, 7. Nikki and Susanna. For execution, 4.5, 5.5, 4, 4.5. For Synchro, 5.5, 5, 5, 5.5, 5.5. Hannah and Shad. For execution, 5, 5, 4.5, 3.5. For synchro, 5.5, 4.5, 4.5, 5, 4.5. Elettra and Elisa. For execution, 5, 5.5, 5.5, 6. For synchro, 6.5, 6.5, 6.5, 6.5, 6. Manu, I'm out. For execution, 6, 6.5, 5, 5.5. For synchro, 6.5, 7, 7, 6, 6. Kira and Baha. For execution, 5, 5, 5.5, 6. For synchro, 6, 5.5, 5.5, 6.5, 6. Naomi en Renske. For execution, 5.5, 6, 6, 5.5. For synchro, from all judges, 5.5. Anne-Sophie en Elma.
We're gonna do a song that you never heard before.
For execution, 2, 2.5, 6, 5.5. For synchro, 3.5, 4, 3.5, 3.5, 4. Mukta en Vuurtje.
Dites-moi d'où il vient, enfin je saurai où je vais. Maman dit que lorsqu'on cherche bien, on finit toujours par trouver.
For execution, 6, 6.5, 4.5, 5. For synchro, 6, 5, 6, 5.5, 6. Dorothea en Dorka. Five and a half, 4.5, 6, 6 for execution. And for synchro, 6, 6.5, 7, 6, 6. Claudia and Rebecca. execution, 6.5, 5.5, 6, 5.5. For Synchro, 6.5, 6, 6, 6, 6. Round 4, Carter and Florian. For execution, 1.5, 2.5, 4, 4.5. For Synchro, 3.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5. Stefano and Francesco. For execution, 6.5, 6, 5.5, 6. For Synchro, 6, 6, 6, 5, 5. Rain and Lachlan. For execution, 5.5, 5.5, 5.5, 6. For Synchro, from all judges, 6.5. Nikki and Susanna. For execution, 3, 3, 5.5, 5. For Synchro, 4, 2.5, 3.5, 3.5, 3.5. Hannah and Shad. For execution, 1.5, 2, 6.5, 6. For Synchro, 3.5, 2, 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. Electra and Elisa. For execution, 5, 5, 2.5, 3. For Synchro, 4.5, 3.5, 5.5, 4.5, 4.5. Manu and Maud. For execution, 5, 5, 5.5, 5. For Synchro, 6, 5, 5.5, 5, 5. Kira and Bara. For execution, 5.5, 4.5, 4.5, 4. For Synchro, 5.5, 4.5, 5, 5, 4.5. Naomi en Renske. For execution, 6, 5.5, 6.5, 6. For Synchro, from all judges, 6.5. Anne-Sophie en Elma. For execution, 4.5, 5, 6, 6. For Synchro, 5, 5, 5.5, 3.5, 5.5. Mukta en Guurtje. For execution, 6, 7, 6, 6.5. For Synchro, 6, 6, 6.5, 6, 6. Dorothea en Dorka.
Martin Simon.
For execution, 5, 5.5, 4.5, 5.5. For Synchro, 6, 5.5, 6, 5.5, 5.5. Claudia en Rebecca. For execution, 6, 6, 6, 6.5. For Synchro, 7, 7, 6, 6.5, 6.5. Round 5. Carter en Florian. For execution, 5.5, 5, 5, 6. For Synchro, 5, 5.5, 5.5, 4.5, 5. Stefano en Francesco. For execution, 6.5, 5.5, 7, 7.5. For synchro, 6, 7, 7, 6.5, 6. Rain and Lapland. For execution, 5.5, 6, 7, 6.5. For synchro, 6, 5.5, 5.5, 5.5, 6. Nikki and Susanna. For execution, 5, 5, 3.5, 4. For synchro, 5, 5.5, 4.5, 4.5, 4.5. Hannah and Shad.
You ready to kick some ass?
For execution, 1, 1, 6, 4.5. For synchro, 2.5, 1.5, 2.5, 3, 3.5. Electra and Elisa. For execution, 7.5, 7, 4.5, 5.5. For synchro, 6.5, 7, 7, 5.5, 5.5. Manu and Maud. For execution, 5, 5, 6, 5.5. For synchro, 5.5, 6, 5.5, 5, 5. Kira and Bara. For execution, 4.5, 4, 5, 5. For synchro, 5, 4.5, 5, 4.5, 5. Naomi and Renske. For execution, 5.5, 6, 5, 5.5. For synchro, 6.5, 5, 5.5, 6, 5.5. Anne-Sophie and Elma. execution, 5.5, 4.5, 4, 4. For synchro, 5, 6, 5, 5.5, 5. Mukta en Guurtje. For execution, 5, 5, 5, 5.5. For synchro from all judges, 5.5. Dorothea en Dorca. For execution, 5, 5, 6, 6. For synchro, 5, 2, 5.5, 4, 5. Claudia en Rebecca. For execution, 6, 5, 4.5, 5.5. For synchro, 4.5, 4.5, 5, 4.5, 4. This was the last time in this competition. Thank you, judges. Thank you, secretaries. Next competition, we will have 2 simultaneously. It will be boys A on 3 meters and girls C on 1 meter.